Hello and welcome to the Brubacher Beyond podcast, where we are shaping the world we live in so more people can find the construction industry uncommonly refreshing. My name is Chris Senelevich. I'll be hosting the Brubacher Beyond podcast today. I am in charge of business development at Brubacher. I am tasked with finding new opportunities or new industries that we're currently not in. It's one of my things. My second passion at Brubacher is I cook lunches for everybody. On Fridays in the summertime, we do summertime cookouts. It's a appreciation for our employees. We go to the job site, we do a safety message, and we do cheesesteaks and potato salad. And with that, today's topic is something that is really driving a lot of, I would say, talk out in the public, is just the expense of purchasing a home these days, right? Or construction cost right over the border. We have three guests with us today. I will let each guest introduce themselves and tell a little bit of background. But I will say that this podcast was really, from my first guest, I'll let introduce Denny Howell and his post on LinkedIn about this. And it pretty much went viral. And I reached out to Denny and then Scott and then Representative Zimmerman's office to discuss this, because I don't think the public understands some of the behind the scenes costs that are just driving up. I think we all agree inflation is one of them, but there's other things that are driving up the cost of the construction. And I'll say this, I mentioned this when we were talking a little bit before, but construction costs have gone up 38% since COVID. Now, the billings have only gone up 34%. So there's a 4%, I'm going to say, negative to the bottom line in the construction industry as a whole. So some people think that contractors just making money hand over fist. If you look at the numbers, there's a 4% loss in profit. So with that, though, I'll let Denny introduce himself. Appreciate you being here today, Denny.
Thanks, Chris. My name is Denny Howell. I'm with Howell Engineering. I've had a civil engineering surveying firm in Chester County for about 25 years. We just celebrated our 25th anniversary. I'm a lifelong resident of Chester County. Grew up out in near East Fallowfield. Went to Drexel University for engineering back in the late 80s and early 90s. And I got out and I spent my entire career in Chester County doing commercial, industrial, and residential engineering and real estate development work.
Okay.
I appreciate you having me.
So just real quick, engineer, developer, what else does Denny do?
He also is a surveyor, and I also sit on a number of county boards that are geared towards landscapes and the county ordinances that are in place. So I can say that I'm on the board for about 10 years on Chester County 2020, which was a land vision use board. It's ironic that our name is 2020 when we're now sitting here today in 2024. So granted that we were looking into the future, now we're looking into the past. So we're in the midst of also kind of re-looking at landscapes and the needs of the county. And back then in pre-2020, most of our focus was towards open space and preservation of open space. Now, as a topic of this podcast, of course, is affordable housing and how do we achieve affordable housing? Because the demand in the county is huge for housing and far exceeds the supply that we've got. And that's one of the driving forces of why we can't find affordable housing.
Yeah. Next with me, Scott Risbon. I know you from EarthCare,
Yes.
but I know you have a couple other entities or companies. Would you like to introduce yourself? Or please do introduce yourself, Scott.
Thank you very much, Chris. My name is Scott Risbon. I am the owner of EarthCare Incorporated. We started in 1992, right out of college. I, too, am a lifelong Chester Countyan. Grew up in the area, I live in the area, primarily work in the area, although I work in the other counties in the Philadelphia region. We do landscaping and erosion control for very large builders as well as large site contractors such as Brubacher. And I also do some developing as well.
Okay, so you see it from multiple sides.
I do.
What we're going to talk about today. And then we have Priscilla from Representative Zimmerman's office. If you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, my name is Priscilla Eberly. I'm Representative Zimmerman Chief of Staff, and I have a background in construction. Prior to this job, been working in this particular job for about 10 years. advocating for business as well. So I'm very aware of the challenges that businesses face.
Great. Thank you for that. So we're talking about the factors that are driving up costs. Denny, what has driven up costs for you and your businesses? I mean, you probably have a long list, but
We have a long list, and we've had several breakfasts recently about this to discuss. Main thing that drives up the cost is really the upside down supply and demand. That's really what's doing it. A lot of county agencies have discussed finding better ways or more cost-effective ways for housing to be constructed. But the national home builders probably do it better than anybody else in the world. I mean, they've got it down to a science, and the ground cost really is what's driving it. As you know, there's usually three components going into the house cost, which is the ground, the sticks and bricks of the house, and then the soft costs, which would be what Brubacher does, kind of what I do. And those numbers are hard to control. The only way to really control them is to make lots narrower and smaller, thereby building less road, less infrastructure per house. And that's helped a lot because the desire in Chester County for a 1 acre lot or a wide lot is kind of going by the wayside. Nobody wants a 1 acre lot. Nobody wants to mow a 1 acre lot, but it still isn't enough because the land cost ends up just keeping lock and step in it. As we find more efficient ways to build housing, it just drives the land cost up, unfortunately.
yeah. And so I guess taking a step backwards from our perspective, or the easy land to build on has been built, right? There's less land. There's not as large tracts. So you can't go in and just do 100 acres at a time. So you're doing smaller. Your mobilization costs are going up in and out. But then the land that's left, there's a reason why it's left, right? There's either rock underneath of it, or it needs to be imported or exported. So all those things are driving up those costs. What other things? I'm sure there's a list of things, but what other things drive cost in your?
Well, and those things are driving up the cost, but at the end of the day, regardless of how expensive those are, there's still a demand that's there and a value of housing that can be achieved based upon the demand. So it really, as those costs go up, while they may chisel into the profit of the home builder or chisel into the value of the land, those costs were all lower. The home builders would just make more profit because they're going to sell at the top of the market where they can. They're on market rate. That's in selling 300 houses a month. If our labor force can't build 300 houses a month, so they control pace by cost, and they do it very well. I mean, they open up the communities and open up phases, and you see Scott does this like I do every day, and you see what the out of the gate price of housing comes out to get started, and then that price gets adjusted pretty quickly to keep with the pace.
Yeah.
And usually it's to keep the pace down because they're getting high traffic on the weekends, a lot of deposits. They can't deliver 30 houses a month. Pricing goes up, and we keep teetering across the top of that. And as there is less product, there is more demand. And the harder it gets for people to entitle ground and get it approved, the less product there is, and therefore the higher the demand there is.
Yeah, that's one thing is the approval process. I mean, can you talk about that? Like, let's say I have a piece of land, or my family has a piece of land, and I'm going to decide to develop it. What kind of time frame and investment are those steps to get it shovel ready?
Yeah, and we do this for seasoned developers, for national home builders. We do them for landowners, families, and we usually start out the conversation by saying that, at the end of this process, you're probably not going to like us anymore. It's going to be an 18-month to 2-year process that could be well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars of approvals. You may not achieve what you initially set out to get from a density standpoint, but it takes so long to get it approved that it's a rare commodity. When you have an approved project that's ready to go and shovel ready, it's got a lot of value because there aren't many out there, and everyone's clamoring for lots.
Yes.
These days, residential is really where it's at today.
Yes. And Scott, so what do you see from the business side that's driving up your costs?
Well, I know we mentioned a lot of factors, but labor is a blaring factor. I have unskilled laborers making $22, $23 an hour. And years ago, there was this fight for 15 in the construction industry where laborers, everybody was trying to get them to $15 an hour. And that is well surpassed that. I mean, I'm talking not very good unskilled labor in the mid to low 20s. That affects the cost of product. The delay in materials We still have this little bit of a hangover from COVID when it comes to getting materials, specialty type materials, and the just overall approval process. I've done multiple projects, and I have one that I started back in 2008, and I'm still working on it. It's just impossible to get things through nowadays. So, yeah. And what it's doing ultimately is it's squeezing out the younger generation. Folks that can afford houses. Now, it's a struggle with the interest rates being higher and everything else, but my kids are now getting to the age where they want to look at the homes, townhouses, and they can't afford to buy them.
Yeah, I mean, we were on a project and it started, I'm going to say 500,000 was the entry level when we broke the ground when they were selling. By the time that project was done, it was up to $800,000 for those units.
Yeah, and why? Because they can be.
Yeah,
That's why.
Supply and demand.
Supply and demand. That's correct. And not to add in the Scott's thing, but the other interesting dynamic and kind of an unintended consequence, I think, of the Pennsylvania township process is that each township has different regulations. And the county's not planned on a county-wide basis. It's planned on a township-wide basis. So our main corridors, 202, Route 1, 322, and Route 30, and the areas where there should be high-density housing, they don't necessarily have it. And few people can afford to live where they work, right? So what they do, they work in Great Valley. They can't afford to live in Great Valley. So they have to do what I call drive to qualify. They get in their car and they drive west Turnpike or south on Route 1 until they can afford to buy a house. And they get out from Morgantown. Can I afford to live here? I can't. I'm going to keep driving west to the next exit on Turnpike. Can I afford to live here? And then when they can afford to live there, then they live there. And what do? They spend half their life in their car, driving back and forth. And then when I go to my township meetings at nighttime and I hear a unilateral 3 complaints, stormwater, kids, and traffic. And traffic and sprawl is just being spurred by the fact that few people can afford to live where they work. They have to get in their car and drive to qualify.
Priscilla, as a state, how do you work on those issues? If you can give us a perspective from your angle.
Sure. I'm sure mostly we hear when it comes to approval process, we hear a lot more about DEP, stormwater approval, permitting. Obviously, townships, we run into other township approval issues, not necessarily on large construction, but on maybe even smaller projects, more residential as well. And so we actually will advocate for our constituents or businesses to the state or even to the township to see if we can help in any way to expedite that. We also have some legislation that cuts down the permitting timeline so that the businesses can hear back a lot quicker. So those are some things that we are working on. We also are working against a lot of union bills right now for unionized work to keep labor costs down. We realize that we have an inflation problem as well for businesses. So these are all things that we're actively working on as well. We're actually working against prevailing wage jobs. It's really a hardship for a lot of construction companies as well.
Yeah, and all those things just drive up the cost. So let's say, Denny, you have a magic wand, or you can change 3 rules. What would you change?
Well, the first thing we would change would be the interest rates. The unfortunate also thing is that with interest rates so low, people who live in their existing houses are not selling them and moving into another house. So this is leaving no other option for like a young person. Like I've got a son too, wants to move out on his own. And his really only option is to pick through the very few existing houses that are for sale where there's multiple offers above ask. Or buy new construction. That's all there is. And I think there's so many people that have 3 and 4% interest rates. They're just not going to sell those houses, especially to go into a 7 or 8% interest rate. So the market will stay very stagnant, and new housing is all trying to keep pace with the demand. It's not doing it. So the first thing would be a blessing to see the interest rates at least trend back down. The second thing would be, and certainly the Chester County legislators are on it, is to somewhat streamline the legislative process of getting things entitled and approved. It takes so long to do it. There could be a way. The cost of it isn't really as much. I mean, it's definitely a factor, but the time is the bigger factor. And the uncertainty is the large
there's
factor.
a risk. I mean,
it's just so high. Once you've eliminated that risk, you've created tremendous value.
how many projects maybe come to your mind? You were 12 months, 14 months in, and the project was not approved.
I would say almost all of them. And I sit on my township planning commission in Willistown, and I would tell you that you could be 2 to 3 years there very easily. And that's not uncommon in Chester County. That's just a standard.
So
To your point, the township staff, a lot of times, they have no skin in the game. So there's no reason for them to expedite the process, right? And the same thing with DEP and the conservation district. And that time factor is huge because these people are carrying, financial burdens by paying for their approvals, or they may or may not owe money on the properties as well. So you're dealing with some unprofessional things as well sometimes that really clog up everything.
So take us, if you don't mind, you said you had a project from 2008.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of just take us through a fast, from 2008 to 2024. That's a long time.
So what happened was there was a developer, I don't want to name the developer, but back in the day, who owed me a lot of money. And 2008, the world came to an end in our industry with the housing bubble burst, and he decided to give me the property for $1. Now, this property had everything wrong with it that you can think of. Low more map revisions, in the floodplain, wasn't zoned properly. So I learned, and I commonly joke that I'm a junior engineer. Just because of this property, I had every single thing wrong that you can imagine. We finally got our approvals in 2017. We got our preliminary plan approval, got our final approval in 2019. And we were going to start in 2020, and COVID hit. And I have a business with a lot of employees. I have a couple businesses where I was trying to focus to keep everybody, working and keep things. And it was put on the back burner. My 5-year grace period expired. And at that point in time, now I've been fighting with the township. We had our preliminary final approvals. So it's one of those things where now they kind of have me, and the residents don't want to see it happen because it hasn't happened for so long.
Yeah.
So now they think that, I shouldn't do the project and I should just forgive all the work that I've done since 2000.
Since 2008.
Yeah.
So, wow. Well, good luck with that one.
Yeah. It's been a battle.
Yeah. And Scott touched on residents, and not that they're bad at all, but 10, 15 years ago, you'd go to a township meeting and there would be the 1 or 2 people who would attend,
dissenting,
and no one really attended, or there was not much of a voice of opposition. There wasn't really a mechanism in place to rally people to do it. But today, with social media and Facebook posts, it takes literally seconds for you to fill a room with 200 or 300 people. And if you're in a position, like Scott said, where maybe the zoning needs to be changed or needs to be adjusted in some way, and now you've got your hat in your hand and you go to a township building where there's a room full of 300 residents who are voters, voters for the elected officials, and they're going to change hearts and minds. And we watch it happen. So when I sit down with a client, our advice is, if you can't make your plans meet the ordinance to the absolute letter, then you should be prepared to multiply your timeline by a factor of 2 or 3, or maybe never get what you want.
Yeah. So Priscilla, how does that timeline you talked about, if I'm a developer, what does that look like? How can a representative help or assist that? What's the process there?
Sure. Well, I think if it's for a developer, and we've helped a couple of developers as well, like I said, anything from commercial to residential, we are able to advocate on behalf of the business or constituent to DEP to see if we can come to an agreement to expedite the process, especially on a project. I mean, my goodness, from 2008, we would be really pretty disturbed by that amount of time. If somebody came into our office with that complaint, we would get on that right away. And we also talk and work with other representatives from other areas. And we find that by working together and rallying other legislators to go into a DEP, that's very helpful. If it's a township, if you're meeting the ordinances and you're doing everything correct, we're happy to make those calls. I mean, we appreciate our townships for sure. But if you are doing everything that is asked of you, and, time is money, right? So, you have that cost out there, and the longer it goes with inflation, the cost continues to rise. So there has to be a process, and at a time where our economy is already not as good as it should be, okay, and people don't want to spend as much money, we need to really be able to get this work accomplished in a timely manner so we can continue to have jobs for people and to be able to keep costs down, be able to keep people in business. The representative always says, with business, we have everything. Without it, we have nothing. those are some of the things that we can do. So I would say for anybody who's having problem with their timelines or permitting, especially if it's state issues, that's a little easier. But, a township, we're happy to work alongside our township to find out, hey, what needs to happen to speed up a bit. We're happy to do that as well.
And honestly, this particular project that we're talking about, this is a 55 and older affordable housing apartment building, which is greatly needed in Chester County. And the traffic impact study was done. It was requested to be redone, and it's actually less than it was back in 2017 as far as the traffic impact goes. And the stormwater still meets the new requirements of the new stormwater ordinances, and I'm still being turned down.
Yeah. Wow.
Did you reach out to your representative?
I have. I spoke with their assistant, and I've gotten nowhere, unfortunately.
Or maybe even to go higher up the chain, maybe to your senator, or maybe even somebody on more pro-business community. I'm happy to help with any contacts with that as well.
Sure, thank you very much. I'm trying to work with the township. They're not bad people. They're just a little misguided because they're worried about getting reelected, and there's 40 people in the meeting, and then they allow people to call in via Zoom. It's just 2-3 hour meetings every time I go there, and we get nowhere. We get inches,
Right.
not miles.
Right.
So that was one of the things you talked about. And I think about that, what you just said, though, with the interest rate affecting. I have 4 people on my street, 4-bedroom houses. All their kids have moved out, and they're not moving because where are they going to move to? Because it would cost them more money to move because of the interest rate. So fix the interest rate. What are some other contributing factors, or what other, magic wands that you would wave?
It's a tough problem. And New Jersey has tried to crack this nut a little bit by mandating that a percentage of new home construction has to be affordable. It's very hard to do. I just sat in a meeting in a Montgomery County Township a few nights ago, and one of the supervisors, and it was a well-intended question, he asked if we would be providing a block of housing that would be affordable for police or first responders. And I thought that was an interesting question. I thought it was well-intentioned, but I said, that's a slippery slope. I mean, what about hairdressers or mailmen or teachers or...
And lawyers are a big problem because now all of a sudden in today's climate, you can be sued for things such as that because you're not being totally inclusive.
Yeah. Cost is definitely a big factor, but really what would get the most traction and solve this problem quicker would be to address the supply and demand issue. And we're never going to address it with the interest rates will never be back down to 3%, not in my opinion. So there's going to be a block of people with existing housing that just aren't going to sell their house until they pass away or they will it to their children. So it's going to be, and Scott and I have sat in a number of new home builder summits and their trade summits, and they are very optimistic for the next 5 to 7 years of housing. And the representative alluded to jobs. There's a clear distinction between what at least a Chester County municipality will do for a project that is creating jobs or one that's creating school children. Like, I've never in my life been so surprised to see how some townships just don't want there to be any more school kids in there because they don't want a burden on the school system. So it does drive, thank God, there is a demand for 55 and over housing. But to go out and ordinance control zone no school children, to me, is tough. But
Yeah.
It's been very hard to have someone come out and advocate for more housing. Unfortunately, or realistically, people attribute housing with, like I said, more kids, more traffic, more police, and more stormwater. At least commercial industrial brings jobs in stormwater and not necessarily more traffic.
And my argument to that would be you allow more development to happen, and then it creates things like Exton at Main Street or the villages of Valley Forge, where now you have that live, work, play, Eagle View. But you can't promote that if you're being so negatively administrating development and growth.
Yeah, and those projects, I mean, I'm sure everybody's been, I mean, they're just
They're beautiful.
Yeah. And you think about it, that's what the communities used to be back in the early 1900s.
Yeah.
You would own your business at the bottom, you would live up top or work in those communities and
Live, work, play.
Yeah.
The whole live, work, play idea.
Yeah, I was an inspector at the county when the Hankins were building Eagle View. And it seemed so groundbreaking and kind of crazy back then, but now looking back, it was brilliant.
Yeah.
But to try to plan that with 70 some townships in one county is very difficult. It's hard to ask an East Township up in a northwestern part of the county to say, we need to have retail. They don't have the infrastructure for that stuff. They don't have public sewer.
Right.
They don't have the roads. I had a lady stop me one time at a planning commission meeting, and she said, my daughter lives outside of Baltimore and DC, and they have way more development and activity, and they have what she perceived to be less traffic and less other things. And can you explain that? And I said, I'd be happy to. Those areas were planned by professionals and planned on a county-wide basis, as they should have been, where all the infrastructure exists. Like I said, to have for every township to be required to allow for every use, it's hard to ask a very rural township that has to allow for townhouses where they don't have the infrastructure for the townhouses.
Yeah.
So then they can't get, as Scott said, they can't be sued on a fair share. So when you have a West Nant meal, create a townhome community, and then complain about the traffic, well, you're just complaining about the problem that you just created by doing that. Those townhouses, now high density housing, should be planned up and down our existing corridors of infrastructure.
Yeah.
And you have to have supervisors voted in that will administer the conceptual plans. Each township has their own concept plan, comprehensive plan. And they're usually very well thought out by very good professionals. Denny does a lot of this kind of stuff. But then you have to educate folks to vote in the right people. A lot of supervisors run on, I'm not going to let any more houses be built in the area. Well, they must have lived in caves or something, because they're living in a house right now. Somebody had to build a house where they're at. And our children are the ones that are going to suffer from this.
Yeah, not just our children, our grandchildren.
Right.
I mean, this is going to affect,
It's systemic.
this is going to have a ripple effect that people really can't comprehend right now or don't want to comprehend.
Yeah.
The affordability of housing is not going to come down anytime soon.
Unless they start to allow you to get through the process quicker.
I think that the planning commissions, they play such a vital role in planning your counties and taking a long look at what's needed. And I think you definitely need to have that. I also think, like you just said with your township supervisors as well, you do need to elect somebody who understands that you need to have dedicated areas for certain things in your township. In some places it just doesn't fit, like we're from Lancaster County. Obviously, we have farmland that we need to preserve. We have very fertile land, but there's designated areas for different housing, different businesses, things like that. When I think of affordable housing, I kind of scratch my head because I know plenty of young couples that both have a job. They both work full time and they can't afford a mortgage and a house. So when you talk to me about affordable housing for low income, well, you can't even get affordable housing for two people that work full time. How do you make that happen with the cost right now, let alone the cost of land? How do you put that all together? I don't think anybody's talking about it. It always sounds good. We need more affordable housing. I agree. But how do you make that happen if you even have people who are working actively 2 jobs and not able to afford a house? And we are talking about the next generation who, by the way, is going to be there to work the jobs that we're going to need to be able to build this and sustain our economy. So we have a disconnect. And then the other piece that, I'm just going to slide in there is the property tax piece for our senior citizens who can't hold their homes, who have their kids out of school. That's another challenge that you're going to have as well.
So what about regulations? There's over-regulation. I think we'd all agree here. But what regulations are affecting the cost?
Overregulation is a major problem. I saw a cartoon that showed somebody very influential cutting down a tree, and it said regulations. And during COVID, I don't know if you're aware of it, but the legislature actually put on hold some regulation, okay? Because we didn't need them. We needed business to grow. We needed to stimulate the economy. And the question became, do we actually need these regulations anyway? So you have the unfunded mandates that come down from the state down to the townships that then just roll down into the community and into the businesses. So the representative I work for has a lot of bills pushing back against regulations on multiple fronts, engineering cost as well, for different townships, and also bills pushing back on DEP, because we do have to get rid of some of those regulations because that is where a lot of cost is incurred.
Yeah, and I would add to that, obviously I say this tongue in cheek, because the more regulations that exist, the more work that I have to do, and the more impossible it is for a layman to do my job. So I sit on a number of home builder boards with the regulations, but what we've seen and what for probably the last 20 years is what we would call regulation by policy, where some of the legislative agencies would have policies, which a policy doesn't go through the same process that a law goes through. It doesn't go through the economic, the ERC process, through Harrisburg. So there would be a policy, and the policy would be something like the water should be made cleaner. But then they would develop regulations by then, but those regulations wouldn't go through the ERC process or through Harrisburg. So they would be policies that were enforced as regulations, and they've run amok. I mean, it's become crazy. If each one of those new regulations had to be looked at on its effect on the economy, its effect on jobs, its effect on housing and the cost of everything, a lot of them wouldn't last 5 seconds on the floor in Harrisburg, but they don't ever make it there. They end up getting promulgated down through the different legislative bodies as a policy. And we'll often hear this. We'll be like, Denny, this is just a policy. And I'm like, well, I get it, but it's being enforced as a regulation.
Yeah.
So for a while, the Home Builders Association, they called it regulation by policy. They lobbied through the PBA, the Pennsylvania Builders Association, through Harrisburg a lot, but I introduced legislation through Senator Dan Truitt a number of years ago. I spent like $100,000 of my own money to put in a process whereby when plans get submitted, like Scott said in his project, to a township, the township would be required to retain 3 engineering firms, which would never be me. We don't do township engineering work. And that those 3 engineering firms would bid on the review process. They would say, I can review these plans for $12,000 or $18,000 or $20,000. And then that would be awarded, and then that would be reviewed by them. But right now, unfortunately, it's just, Scott hired one of his engineering buddies to design plans, and I was hired by you to review them. I could review them and critique them for the next 10 years without even blinking. And meanwhile, I'm charging Scott to review them. So it's
the time factor that is costing as well.
The time factor, yeah.
We introduced that legislation. I had the right state senator on the right local governmental affairs committee, Senator Truitt. We drafted the bill. I got statewide buy-in by other engineering agencies. And at the time we got to Harrisburg, I was dressed up in my suit. And so I thought this was going to be my legacy, that I would leave one day this business kind of changed. And I had a state senator who was at the time the head of that committee, put us in an anteroom. She opened the door and said, I would never support this bill. And then that was the end of that. I didn't understand at the time what a bill dying in committee meant, but it meant that that bill was never going to even make it to the floor to ever even be voted on. I didn't realize that could happen. I was foolish trying to eat a whale in one bite.
Yeah.
But what I discovered later on was that the larger engineering firms that predominantly just do municipal review work, they were a supporter of that one elected official and basically said,
don't do it. We don't want
this. I can't blame them. That's what they do. That's what their profession is. But it's unfortunate because it does drive up the cost. It drives up the cost to the developers, and it ends up probably making guys like me more money because it takes me longer and harder to do it. Yet I'm still advocating for it to be changed.
In the same breath, I feel the same way when I do work for individual spot lot homes for some of our builders, because we obviously do work for the big multinational builders, but we also do some small stuff. And I see the amount of money that they have to pay for a rain garden, for example, on a 2-acre property, that there's so much pervious area, but just because it's in the ordinances that they have to do that. And they'll spend $20,000 sometimes for a rain garden that is not always necessary, but I have to build them accordingly, but I feel bad.
Is it easier to get those smaller lots approved?
No way.
No. It's just as hard to get a single house approval as it is a 20 house.
It is, and it's ironic. I was just in Hilton Head to run a boat north, and my friend down there, whose grandfather built this boat, they're one of the largest home builders in Hilton Head, built all the T-lines. And he called me the day after I left. I thought something was wrong, to vent because he was being shut down because he has to put in. He's like, have you ever heard, Denny, of silt socks? And I'm like, of course. But down there, this is a brand new thing. Before, last month, you would basically write on a piece of notebook paper where you're going to build your house, and that was it. And I said to Trey, well, welcome to the way it's done up north.
Yeah.
Well, and
it costs tens of thousands of dollars in engineering.
Big multinational developers, the Toll Brothers of the world and the Lennar Homes and Pulte's, they do so much better in the Carolinas and Georgia and Alabama and Florida because regulations are nowhere near. I mean, they still have stringent regulations when it comes to erosion control and everything else, but the process to get it through is so much faster, I've been told. It's night and day. I mean, instead of taking 2.5 years, it takes 8 months.
And just by way of example, I drove past a Ryan Homes community in South Carolina. I took a picture of it. It said, starting from the low 200s.
Yeah.
And you figure studs cost about the same down there as they do up here. Asphalt costs probably the same as it does. Fuel costs pretty much cost the same as it does. So what is different? Like, why can they do it? And it's because there's entirely more supply than there is demand. That is what would change it, but that will not change anytime in our soon in southeastern PA region, which is one of the most desirable places to live in the country.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of people that stay and relocate within miles of where they grew up, the statistics are very high around here. I mean, we do have great things. You can go to the Poconos, you can go to New York City, you can go to Philadelphia, you can go to Baltimore, you can go to Lancaster.
Jersey Shore.
Yeah, I mean, we have all kinds of treasures here. And
4 seasons, no hurricanes, no tornadoes, no earthquakes.
Yes.
Jobs.
A couple of earthquakes every once in a while.
Yeah, every now and then.
You know, that's okay. So we have approval process, the townships, interest rates, regulations, supply and demand. I don't see any of that stuff going away.
But you know what's ironic is some townships, we like to say, are open for business, wherein other townships are just completely not. I'm doing a project right now where we're taking a creepy house that was built in the 50s that kids are partying in right now, and it's on a 1 acre parcel, and we're going to demo it and put in a daycare, a greatly needed daycare in this particular township. The 2 townships that are contiguous to that township are so anti-development that this would never happen in those townships. And I drive around all day long checking job sites and I see opportunities in both of these other 2 townships that are just completely missed. And the farmhouses and barns that are just being demolition by neglect because they too have to meet these crazy regulations. And then you have to go through a historic commission that piles on more and more regulations. So it's just, and I'm a preservationist. I like to do that. I've restored barns and farmhouses. My office is an old farmhouse. I've stopped doing it now because it's too cost preventative. I'm not going to spend 2.5, 3 years on a project and lose money.
Yeah, you can't.
Yeah.
I see this a lot. You know, there's people that have wishful thinking. At the end of the day, it does need to be profitable. Without the profit, you can't keep a business running. You know, it's just...
You feel dirty going into these townships and asking to build homes and or to restore things because it's almost like extortion. They look at you and they go, hey, what can you give us above and beyond? And no, we don't like that idea. Oh, you have too much density. And we are in business to make money, to your point, Chris. I mean, we're not in business to do this and not make money.
When there are municipalities that are in need of infrastructure improvements, whether they be traffic or utility, or maybe they even want to do a new park or something like that, there's definitely opportunity there for that. There's definitely opportunity where a municipality that is in need of some kind of improvements for them to consider other zoning and other uses. And that's really how things get done. That's how things get completed.
Yeah, I think there are some municipalities that are going to go through a rebirth. I think there are municipalities that it's going through right now. I mean, you can see like the transformation that's happened in Phoenixville. Tremendous. And you go there now and there's beautiful walkways. There's an atmosphere in the city. There's businesses thriving. I wish other communities could see that and understand what it takes to get there.
It all comes down to leadership and who's voting in who. And, you know, as far as commissioners / supervisors are, because they really control everything. The township manager is there to advise them. Township engineer is there to tell them what they can and can't do within the law. Township solicitor is making sure everybody's kind of kept wrangled in. But the supervisors, it's their fiefdom, and they can make decisions on whether they want to change things or not.
Yeah.
Crazy.
I just wanted to say, I know of a lot of really good township supervisors who do incredible work for their community. They're loved by their constituents. They have a variety of business. They work with their businesses as well. And then, you know, you do have the other townships that you hear a lot of complaints about. One thing I'd like to say is, you know, the representative had a high tunnel bill for farmers to allow them to put hoops in the ground to be able to grow their produce. And even though we did legislation, it took a little bit of time to pass that in the House. It sounds crazy that the farmers wouldn't have to do stormwater management in their fields. So we have fought that, and that's actual law. You know, the difference between law and regulation is more of a guidance, okay? You have a hearing, 60 to 90 days to pass that. Most of the public has no idea what regulation is being passed in order to write in and to complain about it. And sometimes even when you do say that this regulation isn't going to work, I saw DEP already say, well, we've had some complaints, but we think it's good, so we're going to pass it anyway. there's 90 days of a new regulation where legislation can take years. Now, I would say there was just an engineering bill done similar to get to the problems that you had spoken about earlier. And sometimes with this legislation, we just have to keep reintroducing it and re-educating people so they understand the importance of it. And I think that goes along with saying we need more qualified people to run for elected positions that understand the way the world works. But not everybody wants to go through the turmoil of running for office, which I understand too, because it's very ugly.
And that's an excellent point. It really is, because it is probably a pretty well thankless job that you have, because you're never popular, not with everybody for sure. And I was going to say earlier, at least at the supervisor level, to have term limits would be great. And again, I agree, Priscilla, there's some fantastic township supervisors that really represent their townships well, and there's other ones that, in my opinion, don't represent them as well. And there's been places where there's a personality in a township for 26 years. It's a person that has run and rerun, and sadly, I know of firsthand ones where they'll run as one party to get elected, and then they switch to the other party the minute that they get elected, and they stay that way until the next election cycle. No one really pays attention, and they'll be advisor for 25, 30 years. And until you can get someone who is willing to do like what Priscilla said, is step in there and do that. And like you said, it's a thankless job. We see a lot of their decisions, I call it the grocery store effect. They just don't want to be at the grocery store and have someone come behind them and be like, I can't believe that you let that farm get turned into houses. How could you do that? I used to live there. And they're just looking to do whatever kind of keeps them out of trouble as most as they can. And I don't blame them. That would be an exhausting job where you're just, making half the people out there completely unhappy with you. And then today's world, the old days, one or two people came to the township meetings. Now they'll start a Facebook page, campaign, make T-shirts about you, put signs up. I mean, if you drive around my township, where I sit on the planning commission, there are Save Rockville Farms signs everywhere. Why people ask me about it all the time? They just see the signs everywhere.
Yeah, what is it?
Yep.
And to Denny's point as well, I thoroughly agree with you. I've done projects where the supervisors are extremely educated and very motivated to make positive change. But to Denny's point earlier, yes, the density should be where the major thoroughfares are. And I found that a lot of the township supervisors in those areas are trying to decrease their density when they are where the density should be. For example, where you live in Willistown, it is a rural feel, and there's not a lot of major highways in that area. So maybe that makes sense. But along the 30 bypass or Route 100 or 202, you still pass a lot of open fields and a lot of areas that could be positively developed, and infill sites that could be turned into something nice versus something that's currently sitting there.
So with the Chris's point, that's why the boroughs are revitalizing. Their infrastructure's there, their streets are there, their sewer and water are there. It's more affordable to live there. You can walk and shop and eat, and go out, and Phoenixville is fantastic. Oxford will be the next one. I just drove through the other night. It will be going. Kennett is fantastic. Westchester obviously started it.
Yep.
I'm a Coatesville guy, so I want to see Coatesville happen. I really do.
I think it will. I think Coatesville's going to be
the next
be there. The next.
It's the only city between Philadelphia and Lancaster.
Yes. So with that, I appreciate everybody's time. I would say if you like this podcast, give it a thumbs up, share it. If you don't like it, say you don't like it, or send me an email or a text. We're always looking for topics. We appreciate everybody's time here today. Thank you so much for being guests.
Good to meet you, Priscilla.
Thank you.
Yes, good to meet you all.
Thanks for listening to the Brubacher podcast today. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our podcast so you can listen to the new episodes each month. Share it with your friends in the industry and those who might like to learn more about the construction industry. Feel free to check out our website at www.brubacher.net. I'm Keith Brubacher, president of Brubacher Excavating Incorporated, and we hope you found our discussion insightful, and we look forward to the next time together.